Good morning. Sorry for the late start. I'm Felicia Marcus, Chair of the Board. Today's Tuesday, June 2nd at 9:05 a.m. To my left, Vice Chair Fran Spivey Weber. To her left, Board Member Dee Diadamo. To my right, Board Member Tam Dodak. And to her right, Board Member Stephen Moore. Okay, I can already tell this is going to be difficult. I less than 4 hours sleep because my flight had a mechanical difficulty. So any words that don't string together, that's my excuse for the day. Mr. Howard, will you please introduce the staff that's assisting us today?
Yes, to my right, Karen Turgovich, Chief Deputy. To my left, Michael Laufer, Chief Counsel. John Bishop is on vacation today. And assisting the board are Janine Townsend and Courtney Davis.
Tyler now, yes.
Well, congratulations, Courtney.
For those of you who don't know the emergency evacuation procedures, and a refresher for those of you who think you do, look for the nearest exit sign. If you hear an emergency sound, it is. Take your stuff, your friends, and proceed cautiously out of the building. We regroup in Cesar Chavez Park near J and 10th. If you join us, you'll know when the all clear sign comes to come back in. The meeting's also being webcast and recorded, and what that means is that when you come up to this microphone, it's important to get close enough to it that you know the amplification is happening, so that not only we can hear you, but the folks on the webcast can hear you and the people in the back of the room. But don't get so close to it that you touch it, because that creates little clicky noises that are tough for some of the folks who are listening on the line. Also, please turn your sound makers to stun or silent, or turn them off, just out of courtesy. And with that, we're on to the public forum, which is when any member of the public can speak to us about something that is not on today's agenda. Any? No cards today. Okay. Next, we have minutes from April 21st and May 19th through 20th board meeting. Any motion?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Carries. It's just water. Yeah, we're all right. And there are no electronics right there, I don't think. Yeah, wasted water, right? It's just a small, you can drink all you want. Okay, we have items 2 through 4 uncontested. Do we have any cards on, oh, Mr. Lawford?
Well, and I was also going to point out, at least as of this moment, you may want to query the audience, or the board may prefer to hear the items, but items 7 and 8 have no comment cards either. If the board wanted to include them as part of the consent calendar, they'd be free to.
Anyway, it's helpful, if you're going to speak, it's good to fill out one of those blue comment cards. All right.
Is anyone speaking on 7 and 8?
Anyone for 7 and 8? Okay.
Oh, I see a hand. I see a hand.
Okay.
Which one?
8. Okay. All right.
In this
So-
case, I will move items 2, 3, 4, and 7.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposition? I didn't hear any. All right, great. So let's go back to the order of business, and our next informational item will be item number 5, update on the ongoing drought emergency.
So Amanda Montgomery will be presenting the drought update. We also have here today Ron Milligan from the Bureau of Reclamation to talk about some of the issues on Shasta Reservoir, temperature issues. And the Delta Water Master is joining us as well, Michael George.
Okay, so I'll get started. Amanda Montgomery, I'm the Program Manager for Water Rights Permitting, and I'm going to give a brief update on our urgency change requests and our temporary transfers. So since the last board meeting, we issued an urgency change to June Lake Public Utility District in the Mono Lake area, and they asked for a relaxation of their fisheries bypass term to provide more water in their service area. This is the same request that we processed last year, and it went into effect yesterday. So, yeah. We are also processing a request on May 27th from Sonoma County Water Agency. We issued them an urgency change on May 1st that reduces the flows in the Russian River. They had some further changes that occurred in their situation. The Lake Mendocino receives inflows from the Eel River, and Lake Pillsbury has a FERC variance that was issued. So that affects the inflow that they're getting into the reservoir and changes their situation. They've asked to have reduced flows in the Russian River by June 16th from what's authorized in our urgency change. So we're processing that and are on track for action by the 16th. So. We also have 2 transfer petitions that we've received on May 22nd. Both of them were noticed yesterday. The notice period ends on June 16th. The first was from South Sutter Water District. They petitioned to transfer 6,000 acre-feet from water in Campfire West Reservoir to several state water contractor agencies. And the second transfer was from the United States Bureau of Reclamation and Contra Costa Water District. They requested to transfer 500 acre-feet that's stored in Las Vaqueras Reservoir to Byron Bethany Irrigation District. So if we do not receive any comments during the notice period, we'll act on these requests by June 22nd. And if we receive comments, we'll act by July 13th. So that concludes the update on the urgency changes and the transfers. And I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. On the enforcement section update, there haven't been any curtailments since the last board meeting. So, and with that, I would move on, I think, to the Delta Water Master.
Thank you, Michael George, Delta Water Master, and I just wanted to give you a brief report on the early returns to the voluntary water conservation program proposed by riparians in the Delta. The applications for participation in the program were due yesterday, and we have about 200 applications. There may be some duplicates in that. We've discovered a couple of situations where they both filed physically and electronically, so that number may change a little bit. Obviously, it's a lot to go through. We're currently involved with cataloging all the applications. So what I can say about them is pretty much cursory and anecdotal. But it appears to me that the majority of the conservation savings are proposed to be achieved through land fallowing. But there are some very interesting and creative plans that involve some things like changing crops or changing the way crops are irrigated, and also significant investment in irrigation technology, which is really good because even though you wouldn't say that that irrigation technology investment was prompted by the voluntary program, because it obviously takes a longer time, it also indicates some significant investment since 2013. And it's the gift that keeps on giving, because those facilities will be in place after the drought is over, or when the drought is interrupted, I guess. So we're going through the applications now. Virtually everybody has complied with the requirements to give us a map. Sometimes it's both a parcel map and Google Earth, which indicates the fields that are at issue. It's also pretty clear that there has been a lot of neighbor-to-neighbor cooperation where, for instance, a group of people who work closely together, manage farms in the same vicinity, will designate certain lands for fallowing, which have the lowest value crops, so that the higher value crops, even if they're owned by other farmers, are getting cultivated and developed. So hopefully that will result in more crop per drop and more farm gate value per drop of water used.
Real quickly, Mr. George, you mentioned about 200 applications received. Roughly speaking, what's the population potentially of potential participants in this voluntary program by riparians?
It's very hard to correlate those two because a number of the applications refer to half a dozen or more statements of diversion and use. So we know that there are 1,500 to 2,000 diversions in the Delta. The participation in this program was anticipated to be almost exclusively in Central and South Delta, so that's roughly half. But I would say, again, anecdotally, it appears to me that well over half of the Central and South Delta have proposed to participate. And that is very preliminary and anecdotal, but lots of statement numbers. And so, among other things, we're having to cross-reference them and make sure that one farmer who is participating but maybe cropping his entire riparian land is married up with a farmer who's fallowing enough to make up the 25% on the total between the two.
That's the type of high-level answer I expected. Thank you.
And I have a question. What is the, what techniques are you going to be using and the Water Rights Division going to be using to follow up to make sure that the savings are in fact coming in? Because I know that was a concern. It's an expense for everyone, and but I was really thrilled to see this program come to life, because I feel like we're going to have to figure this out at some point. So why not now? And with cooperation, I like that.
Well, exactly. And administration of the program is going to be an important responsibility that Delta Water Master's Office anticipates sharing not only with the Division of Water Rights, but also with some people in the Delta. Some of the water attorneys in the Delta have offered their assistance in monitoring and getting us access and doing some of the groundwork. As well, I anticipate that some of the project contractors will be involved in reviewing some of the plans. All of these plans, once we get them cataloged, are public information, so everybody will have an opportunity to take a look at it. It's pretty clear that within the Delta, there are different kinds of experiments going on, so I think there's going to be some learning among farming interests in the Delta. I think particularly the ability to, well, for fallowing, it's pretty straightforward and simple. We're getting the specific fields, and then we can monitor those not only through our moving around the Delta and observing things. We're going to do a full land use survey this summer. So we'll have plenty of opportunities for in-the-field observation. But with fallowing fields, we also have the benefit of the satellite imagery. The Landsat overflies the Delta every 16 days. So with respect to monitoring the fallowing, that'll be fairly straightforward. Some of the other creative approaches that have been proposed will require more creative monitoring. So for instance, in a circumstance where someone says, we're going to reduce the number of irrigations on a crop, for instance, we'll probably ask for those schedules so that we can do spot checking on the schedules. But because the program is just now being reviewed, we're just seeing these plans. The plans have a great deal more variety than I frankly had anticipated. So we're going to have to be creative about how we do the monitoring.
Thank you for your work on this. If you could talk a little bit about how the information that you're gathering would help fit in with some of the other efforts that you've been involved in with UC Davis and others on consumptive use.
Sure. One of the great benefits of this program is it will give us a lot of rich data that we've lacked in the past in terms of how we administer water rights in the Delta, and particularly the issue of fallowing. There has been a great deal of, there hasn't been much clarity about how diversions, consumptive use, and return flows operate in the Delta, because much of the farming takes place below the water table, so there's seepage and so forth. So we're going to have a statistically significant sample of fallowed lands all around the Central and South Delta. And because this voluntary program is running at the same time that we have a consumptive use monitoring and measurement program going on, the contract with UC Davis as the lead academic participant in that will give us a good deal of information about what the actual consumptive use on a fallowed field in various places in the Delta will be. That's been hard to figure out. The way we have estimated consumptive use has been based on field level surveys, the last of which was done in 2007, so it doesn't reflect a lot of changes that have taken place in the interim. And obviously in 2007 did not reflect the stress on the water system that we're seeing this year. So my hope is that by being able to monitor the voluntary fallowing here, we'll get a much better handle on what it means to fallow a field that happens to be below the water table. It may mean that you get much less consumptive use savings by fallowing that field, simply because you get a lot of seepage. And as one of the conditions in the voluntary program, we said we're not going to acknowledge groundwater substitution, because in the Delta, drawing water from a well usually means almost immediate impact on the surface flow. So we're treating quote-unquote groundwater wells in the Delta as though they were another method for surface diversion. And obviously there's seepage that is not controlled. It's not pumped in, it is only pumped off. So we're going to be watching the water return flows as carefully as we're watching the diversions. So the answer to the question is that by doing the consumptive use study for the whole Delta for this period of time, we'll have a lot of overlap, a lot of rich data. I've been joking that the data that's going to come out of this program is going to be fodder for PhD students at Davis and San Luis Obispo for years to come.
Okay, and then the other question has to do with either perceived or actual concern about equity that some have expressed to me. So let's say you've got half the riparians in the Delta that participate in this program. Will staff be adjusting the supply and demand curves? And could it happen that for those that are not participating in the program, that they get a free ride because the curves are adjusted in their favor?
I don't think that's likely, because the program relates exclusively to riparians, and although there is a great deal of riparian demand in the Delta, because the Delta is just chock full of natural water courses, the curtailments are likely to require water users in the Delta who get curtailed, assuming that they will be curtailed, to move to their riparian rights. So we'll get real savings from this, again, assuming the pre-1914s are curtailed and that the production is all or mostly all under the riparian rights. And there will likely be curtailment of riparians as well. The only benefit that a participant in the program gets by offering a certain 25% that's verifiable and monitorable and so forth throughout the season is that we agree that we will not use our enforcement to go after them if the eventual curtailments for riparians go deeper than would be 25%. So first of all, it'll come later. So the savings under the voluntary program start earlier and are more certain. There are likely to be curtailments of riparians later. They could go deeper. So you've got a, it's kind of multivariable equation to figure out whether this program with certainty up front would ultimately produce more or less water than a deeper curtailment later. Having said that, nobody, non-participants in the program don't face any higher risk of enforcement or review of their use than they would otherwise. If they get curtailed, non-participants get curtailed more deeply, we'll have the enforcement obligation with respect to that. And so that enforcement will be, will carry on regardless of whether they're, how do I want to say that? There won't be any greater focus on riparians who don't participate than would have happened in any case because of the curtailments. That's what I'm trying to say.
Right. This goes without saying, but I think in order to have a successful program, we're going to need to be out on the street on enforcement, not just monitoring the participants in this program, but then also for those that did not participate so that there isn't this sense that folks are getting a free ride. And then with respect to maybe anything you can do on rumor control, because what I've heard is that these charts will get readjusted and that it could result in favorable conditions for those that didn't participate. So to the extent that that's not accurate, and anything you can do to explain that to folks, they ought to feel good about what they did. Thank you.
Yes, and I think we all feel like, particularly if it turns out that we've got a very high percentage of participation, which it appears that we do, that could have significant impact, which is exactly the impacts we were going for.
Rumor control thing is, as anybody hears anything that people raise, we should just get it to Michael, because then you can go ahead and dispel it, whether you do it on the website or somewhere. FAQs are always really helpful that way. It is interesting because some people jump to a conclusion of what this means. They say, well, here's 25. Well, what if the curtailments are 35 and they got away with 25? But the answer is they did it now as opposed to having to cut deeply later. The whole point of this was so they could contribute to the solution, say, we understand water rights law and we're subject to it, but we want to plant our crops with some certainty, which I think sometimes people don't understand the construct of why this was appealing to people.
And it is important, obviously, for us to do everything we can to allow the farmers to produce the most valuable crop that is possible given the terrible drought.
I mean, no, this is probably not the time for it, but given all of the conflict over the factual issues in the Delta, it sounds like this is a great opportunity on top of what you were already doing to try and make some decisions and get some information out there to dispel the he said, she said, they said kind of atmosphere that we have here. But obviously there are going to be legal issues to be resolved, and there are conflicts among various water users both in and out of the Delta.
And just so, the consumptive use project that we had anticipated is becoming more complicated because lots of people, the good news is lots of people are focused on that information and that data. That's the good news. The bad news is it's going to cost more. So I'm going to be coming back with my tin cup, rattling it to various folks, including Mr. Howard, I think.
Not flinching.
Good.
Karen, maybe. Tom's not. No, thank you. It's very important work.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ron Milligan with Reclamation. I did have a few charts I wanted to talk off of and give you an update as to where we are with some of our temperature management and planning at Shasta, and some developments that are in the works. as we've worked through the plan from April into May, now we're into June, and probably wanted to make you aware of a few things that are going on. Last week, and just to give you the brief summary, last week, and I'll go over into this little detail, we've been working with the May temperature profiles that we take periodically at Shasta Lake. And this is a key driver in our temperature planning. And as we've talked about before, the temperature plan to protect Winter Run Chinook is, really almost a cornerstone to the amount of water we're able to get out of Shasta, and then that kind of drives a lot of the settlement contracts on the Sacramento River, ultimately water that may get down to the Delta, interactions with Oroville and Shasta operations as well. And I think questions that have come up about refuge supplies for south of Delta, exchange contractor supplies, interactions with the Friant system, just a whole number of things are pretty predicated on what types of flows we can release at Shasta. So as we've worked with the temperature profile, which is fairly dynamic through the spring, we've noticed that in some of the May readings that we were getting much warmer water than we had in the model when we were working with it in April. It's so much so in some of the places that we thought we may have had some bad data. And we've asked some of our field staff up at Shasta to go back and verify the profile. And even to the extent here last week, had staff from our Folsom office drive up with their equipment that they used to take temperature profiles at Folsom to validate the numbers. So I want to show you a couple of charts that we have and give you an update as to where we are in trying to update the plan. Just for quick reference, this is the chart we've kind of been looking at a number of our updates for Shasta Lake. Kind of shows where we were last year in terms of storage and where we are this year, and where we would have been tracking, or where we did track back in the 76, 77 drought. Again, I think part of what's interesting about the graph that influences what I'll be showing you with the temperature profiles is just how much water we got into inflow into the reservoir in the early part of the season, predominantly in those December storms, as well as in the February timeframe. Just as we recall, those were very, very warm storms and very intense storms. So the good thing is they generated a lot of inflow, but they were probably warmer water, and there was not a lot of snowpack that was associated with those storms. So what we've seen is that the cresting of the storage at Shasta, like many of our other Sac Valley and San Joaquin Valley reservoirs, crested very early by a good month to 6 weeks, and not being supported with inflows that are the product of snowmelt predominantly, which is colder. This is a profile of when we talk about the temperature profiles at Shasta, this is an example, and this is the profile that we used in the red for the temperature plan that we compiled back in April. Now, this profile, we've also plotted with that the profile back of a year ago, back in 2014 in April. And as you can see that it's elevation of the lake on the vertical axis, and the horizontal is the temperature of the water. Slightly warmer water by these readings through a lot of the water column, but as you get up to the more the higher parts of the lake that were above, in this case, between the middle gates and the lower gates of the temperature device that we talked about the last time we visited, that was a little bit cooler. And we felt that cooler water blended with the water that we had down at the lower levels with the releases in a pattern that we had different from the year ago. We thought we had a plan that we could cobble together to meet the various needs. But those were always caveated that, as I said, this is a dynamic process, and that we would true this up with a May plan, and that we would make adjustments with it from a May plan through the summer to try to hit the compliance point. And as we had this was 56 degrees at the bridge just above the Clear Creek confluence on the Sacramento River. And as we kind of talked about the last time, that was a location that was far enough downstream. It's fairly far upstream for typical temperature compliance, but seemed to cover most of the spawning for winter run Chinook. So this seemed like a plan that we could make work, but we needed to continue to monitor this. Well, through a lot of, as I talked about, a lot of going back, checking the validating temperature profiles, and I don't know if you kind of caught as we shifted, we're seeing more separation, meaning warmer water at those lower levels. Part of this is some instrumentation adjustments that were done in calibrating the instrument, and that's why we went out with some additional equipment to validate these values. But that has also led to enough of a shift in the temperatures that we now find it very difficult to cobble together, particularly with the flow pattern that we had with the April plan, to meet 56 degrees at Clear Creek. And what we found is if we continue to try to hit that target with the flows that we had anticipated, we would end up running out of cold water and hitting a spot where we've got very warm water at the lower gate level of the device, and probably run the risk of some very ramping up of warmer water in the September timeframe, which is a combination of cooler early but very warm later. That is a combination that's not good for the mortality of the fish. So based on this information, we have agreed to not increase releases in June. The plan would have had us having Keswick releases at roughly 8,500 CFS. We've actually had backed off of our 7,500 CFS part of the plan previously just because there was a lull in some of the diversions in the river. So we're currently at 7,200 CFS release at Keswick. And we're going to hold there until we kind of get through this planning process with, because it's kind of a two-pronged effort for us. We have some Federal Endangered Species Act interaction with no fisheries that we need to make sure that we handle properly, and we also need to be true to the 90-5 process with the board and try to figure out how we have a plan that makes the best use of this particular set of cold water and what's a flow pattern that we can use to kind of stretch this out. Just to give you an idea as to why this seems more difficult than it has, and I do apologize for the grayness of the background. What we've done is taken some mid to late May profiles at Shasta for the last 5 years and put them together, and the black line that's unfortunately the most to the right is this year's profile from May 26th. The profile from last year is kind of the orange dots, and that's had all those storage levels were just a hair below. By this time last year, we had some areas that were a good degree and a half cooler than we see today. But as you can see, even in some of the other years, those were all much cooler volumes of water. And when you get those other 3 years that are on the plot that had some volume where you could actually get into the upper row shutters, you had a lot more capability to mix water than we have this year. So this is why this is, it was difficult in April, and it's only gotten more difficult with the nudging over of about a degree of water in what the model input is as of today. So where we are from a process standpoint is we've been working with board staff and NOAA Fisheries. We brought together some knowledgeable biological staff from, in addition from those agencies, some of our reclamation biologists, biologists from Fish and Wildlife Service that worked a long time on the river and that reach, as well as State Fish and Wildlife, and are cobbling together and looking at, to be honest, a lot of looking at temperature impacts at above 56 degrees and thinking about spawning location and timing and doing some series of temperature runs to look at what's the right combination of flow release as well as target location and even timing. I think we're looking a lot at the timing of the run coming up. That typically is, depending on the year, more into June, early July. So we're looking at that time frame as maybe trying to focus the cold water we have, again with the strategy that can we get something through the season and not have a run-up of temperatures at the end. Because these mortality curves really become quite difficult when you get up into the 60-degree range specifically. So we're having some really good discussions. Our hope is that during this week we will have a lot of FaceTime with each other with some modeling and going through some ideas. We set aside most of the afternoon for all this week. Had a good discussion yesterday to recraft a plan that kind of trues up back to these temperatures and, you know, what's the right combination of releases. I anticipate that we would see lower releases than we had in the plan in April. By how much, we're still trying to figure out what that balance point is. But also to the degree that there's some reduction there, what does that mean through the rest of the system? And we're trying to lay out those potential trade-offs. At the end of our workshop of a couple weeks ago, I know that the board collectively had some concerns about, okay, where's the buffer? Where's the, well, part of that buffer is kind of lost in these temperatures, and we are at a point where there's a lot of linkage to a lot of things. And so there's certainly, as it relates to the state water project operations and Oroville and some of the questions about Folsom as well, facility management, all the way down into supplies for exchange contractors, refuges south of the Delta, interaction with the Friant water users and some of the arrangements there. All of these are going to probably, you know, they're kind of on hold, some of our transfers we talked about in the fall, until we can figure out what's the right schedule and release pattern here. And again, we're kind of only working with 2 out of the 3 levels of shutters, and so that's complicated this. So again, it wasn't easy to start with, and we've got just that much more warmer water to deal with. So we're trying to reconfirm, but we did get agreement amongst the fish agencies and the board staff to hold with the releases that we had in late May and hold those for at least the next 10 days or the first 10 days of June until we could figure out where we are and if we need to make an adjustment up and down. And we aren't going to actively make shutter change adjustments at Shasta until we figure out where's the right set point in terms of the location that we should be honing in on. We're still looking at the same upper reach of the river, and we're still looking at trying to keep temperatures, you know, within a degree and a half of where we were talking about before.
I ask an obvious question. I think I know the answer, but I'm not sure. And I'm trying to think of the people who are watching over the webcast, or maybe in the back of the room. Why is it that you would, well, first of all, let me thank you for going and double checking on the numbers. That is the kind of thing that we would want you to do versus us crossing our fingers and hoping that last year isn't a repeat, because we keep saying in other contexts that hope isn't a strategy. So thank you for focusing on the data. This is going to be data day, I think, between all of our presentations and the ones to come. But why, again, this may be just the regular person question, but why would you have it where there's warmer cold, but cooler warm weather? What would explain that, the arc of the black line? Why wouldn't the whole thing be hotter all the way through the curve?
It's interesting to see these progress through when you start in January, February, and kind of move across. That upper layer has a lot to do with just the ambient air temperatures and things like wind potentially that will mix water as the lake stratifies. So the lower level is probably more of a product of just the temperature of the water mass kind of as you started and the inflow of your water through the winter, spring. Typically as the lake stratifies. If you think of this as of layers of different density water because of temperature, when new water comes in, a lot of times it will just kind of come and plunge gradually to the place where it finds, oh, this is my family of temperatures, and just kind of spread out at that particular lens. Now, obviously, when you got water at the deepest part of the lake, that's, you know, a good couple of degrees warmer in some of these examples from just over a few years ago. We just had a warmer lake mass to work with to start with, and I've seen a couple of articles and studies from even USGS and NOAA and even NASA that we've had a run of some really warm weather, particularly in 2014, and that's probably the base. Now, the upper layer is the product of probably the volume of the lake, and so we were a little bit higher from that previous graph that we saw. And you know, May was a bit of a cooler month, so that's where, although this is similar, we see just a little bit different in terms of that cooler part at the upper part of the lake.
Thank
you. And it's not a lot of difference. I mean, this scale is probably exaggerated because we kind of pegged it at 44 degrees, but you know, between 32 degrees and this, you know, it's not a lot of difference, and so this is subtle. But when we're trying to do the temperature compliance point, a difference of a half a degree to a degree shifts some of that strategy and how you can stretch this out significantly. So, and not all this water is as easily accessible. Maybe to go back a slide, just the numbers next to each of these dots, although they're at these elevations, that represents the storage in Shasta Lake at those elevations. So you're at some pretty low storage levels at elevation 750. So although we've got more dots down there, that doesn't represent the biggest volume of water, perhaps. And that middle range between the middle gate and the lower gate in those bands here is where we have the most water that we're going to be doing our work with over the summer. And in that range, we've got, well, just that shift of probably in that range of a half a degree or so is significant in terms of trying to hit a 56 degree target. And so we're talking about some subtle changes and maybe shifting up a few miles to try to really target where the reds are. So we've got our work cut out as a multi-agency group over this week, but our intent is by the end of the week to have a draft plan that rejiggers all this, and then we can figure out what that means going downstream.
Talking with stakeholders about it for their brilliant ideas. 'Cause
We
they've
will
come up
be.
with some good ones in the past.
At this point, we have a lot of, let's be honest, I think there's a lot of anxiety from a water supply standpoint, because as I said, this thing
the
links.
fish guys, everybody's
You know,
on pins
from
and
Reading
needles.
to Bakersfield, I think we've got folks interested, and in the fishery community, as to what does this mean. And I've had phone calls to say, well, does this equate, 56 is kind of like, once you cross that line, you have 100% mortality. And that's not the case, but it's certainly a line that we don't want to incur more gradual mortality over the season than we have to. But at some point, you've got to block out the biggest chunk as we can get. So
As part of the trade-off, you know, you talk about the temperature trade-offs, which is a relevant discussion, but as part of the management trade-off, also shrinking the available space for the successful spawning, you know, in terms of, you know, there's a desired amount between Keswick and Clear Creek, but are folks in those discussions among the knowledgeable biologists, are they looking at a smaller area of productivity in order to have some productivity versus losing all productivity?
But what's interesting over the last 4 to 5 years is, though, we've had periods where we've had the cooler water available further downstream. It's also a combination of where's the best looking spawning gravel for the spawning fish. And there have been some gravel injection points just to kind of refurbish the gravel over time downstream of Keswick. And without the really high flows that would take to really mobilize that, a lot of it's probably still sitting fairly high up in the river. And that's where we've seen the bulk of the spawning, even though there have been we've had some discussion, well, are we drawing the fish too far upstream with our temperature plan? And even when we've had temperatures that looked better downstream, they continue to kind of move up to the colder water and finding the better gravel, and that's where we've seen a lot of the spawning. So we're zooming in on that as well, and that probably, if we're willing to go that far up with a compliance point, or at least a management point, you buy yourself probably a half a degree just in that context. And if you change the timing a bit and really target the time where you really start hitting the temperatures and build some buffer in to make sure you don't lose control at the end, we'll see whatever. It's certainly not the optimal condition, but it certainly may be the one that gets us through with much better survival than we would have had otherwise. And then the next, so we're very focused on that reach of the river. The next question is, what's the trade-offs in terms of the flows associated with different strategies? And are there really differences in the temperature management piece of that? And I think that's where we're getting some good feedback from stakeholders on the fishery end of it, but also trying to collect information further down the system from, okay, how would we tighten our belts collectively if we have a constraint of releases here at Keswick on Sac River, then what does that mean for the rest of the system, so that we can figure out how to get through, the rippling that comes with this.
So the focus really does need to be the temperature and the fish, but just wondering, I mean, it seems that there's limited tools available, but on some of the options on flow pattern, are you seeing that that there might be a possibility to address some of the other trade-offs on water supply so that they can be targeted in such a way that it has a minimal impact? There's going to be an impact on water supply, but some way to kind of tighten it up so that there's a minimal impact as much as possible. Or are those flow pattern time periods just inconsistent with the water supply needs?
I think they still line up, but it's order of magnitude is that to stretch this, there is and we still need to try to find this crossing of the two curves. On one hand, if you reduce the flows, you could probably stretch that limited cold water pool you have. But to get to the compliance point, you have to be colder because you're going to have heating as it goes downstream. And we've kind of really done extreme bracketing, probably outside of what you need for any kind of water supply consideration. And some really low flows would have to be very cold coming out of Shasta to get to where we need the cold water, and kind of nullify. You almost ended up at the same temperature that as if you went to a higher flow, but you could be a bit warmer, and you end up at the same place, with the consequence being there's more flow from that point downstream to be able to use. The trade-off becomes, okay, but where is the optimal point where those two cross? And
Okay.
and you might be able to do the one modeling set, but how do you true that up as you move through time?
Yeah, and then adding to that, is there a consideration of, because usually on cold water, you want to hold water in storage as much as possible. And in this situation, the storage is pretty warm. Is there a consideration for, if with reduced flows, that you're going to have a larger bank of warm water as a result? And so some interest in drawing things down for this year, and then also what about next year? A larger pool of warmer water.
Well, that's, you could, as we get into the end of the season next year part, boy, that could go a lot of different ways. A colder winter with a more typical runoff of snowpack probably could make a lot of difference there. We've even tried to think about, well, are there particular storage targets that work better with the gate positions and at particular times? And is there ways to work that as well? We're probably in a realm where we're probably a couple 100,000 acre feet one way or the other in terms of, let's say what we had in our previous plan in the 1.1 range, million acre foot ranges carry over storage into September, we might be a little bit higher than that. For probably a couple reasons. One is maybe the inflows seem to be tracking maybe just a hair better than the 90% exceedance, but we're probably getting some fairly warm water. At least typically your April, May water would be your colder set, and I think what we got is a chunk of warmer there. Now, you get into late June, July, August, yeah, you expect to get warm water, so we probably aren't going to see something that's deviating from the norm that much. So it's a really hard question to answer. I think that where we're really focusing on is what's the best thing to do with this set of cold water this year to get why we've got fish that spawn, egg incubation, emergence, and enough flow to provide some thermal buffer as we get into October. And hopefully we don't have a really, really hot fall, which is going to be very difficult both for the winter run and probably fall run coming upstream. So some flows there are probably going to be, again, part of the, working real time on the flow releases that we have. So a lot of our focus is this year. The next year, I think, will play itself out. In the scope of a typical, and the problem is we haven't had a typical, but the runoff into Shasta in 75% of the year is a couple 100,000 acre feet is very much a statistical, dust or a very thin wedge. But it's in the pattern that we've been in that, in this case, water that we did have was fairly warm as we went from last year into this year. And this both the product of last year was pretty warm, and then the winter, spring that we had warm water coming in. So that's where we've got such a shift, even though volumetrically we're better off than we were a year ago. So a difficult week ahead, and trying to lay out some options and trying to define where their decision space is at.
Chair Marcus. I had a couple maybe brief comments,
Great.
but I think they're important, if I may.
Of course.
So John Lehi, State Water Project Operations. So why is State Water Project Operations crashing this discussion on Shasta temperatures? Actually, I was asked by your staff to be available for questions.
We're all acting as a team. You have to in a crisis like that.
And Ron has already touched on it to a certain extent and has been talked about. That any discussion about Shasta temperature operations cannot be in isolation as it relates to the rest of the system. And so the rest of the system is being operated very tight all the way around. So any significant change to the Shasta temperature plan will have redirected impacts elsewhere to other beneficial uses in the system. And so it's important that we do track what happens with this plan very carefully to evaluate what those potential impacts are and to monitor as we go through the year. So for example, a reduction, as Ron had indicated, if we are anticipating reduced releases from Shasta, this summer, through the de facto settlement agreement between the two projects, we first look at Folsom to make up any differences to the delta, let's say, as far as the delta inflows. If there may be limited ability there at Folsom, so then because of the joint responsibility, we look at DWR and Oroville. But even there may be some limitations on what we could provide. We're running significantly lower in storage in Oroville this year than we were last year at this time. We'll be up against similar type blending operations for temperature, which could limit the amount of the total capacity of release that we make downstream. So these are definitely factors that we need to take a look at. It could very well have impacts, for example, on our ability to provide water for the multiple purposes this coming fall and winter for a combination of rice decomp plus waterbird habitat. So those are the kind of things that have, it will have ripple effects throughout the system. So I think it's just important to, that we keep this in mind going forward on any changes to the plan as we move forward. Thanks.
I think it's important to note also that maybe there are some things that we can do as a board, and I'd like to, if you could, comment on the role that curtailments could play, specifically on those redirected impacts.